Today we are talking about Mythic Plus. However, for a moment, we're not going to be talking about the meta, the top DPS specs, what's OP, who has the best DPS in Mythic Plus. We're talking about when you actually are in your key and inside the dungeons. We're talking about the current situation in the meta when it comes to dungeons. We're talking about the difficulty of the dungeons, but for today we have focused on one thing, which is the major change that happened this season in Mythic Plus. Now, you could be thinking, I know the major change. We have changed the affixes. We have this new Kiss Curse affix, the Xalatat's Bargain, or maybe, I know, now we have Fortified and Tyrannical being cycled every week, and then eventually you have them both together. And someone else could say, no, I know what's the big change. It's the Challenger's Peril debuff, the one that makes you lose 15 seconds of your timer whenever you die. Actually, you would all be wrong, because there is an even bigger change happening this season in Mythic Plus that quite a few players have started noticing. You know, this type of feeling right here. And the type of feeling we are talking about, as you just saw, is the feeling of the way Blizzard changed the crowd control, the stops, and the way they interact with interrupts and silences and kicks for the trash mobs in dungeons. Because, to those who haven't realized yet, Blizzard had this change in this season. Basically, prior to this season, generally speaking, when you are in Mythic Plus, you see 7 different mobs casting, you are a Demon Hunter, you cast Chaos Nova, and you interrupt all of those 7 spells of those mobs. And then those 7 spells are now on cooldown. And you don't have to worry again. You don't have to worry about that fear, that huge dot, that massive AoE damage cast, because they all went on cooldown with a single AoE stun. Blizzard wasn't okay with that. Blizzard thought that the cycling of AoE stops was practically overshadowing the need for interrupts. What's the need of rotating individual interrupts when you can just rotate AoE stun, AoE knockup, AoE stun, AoE knockback, AoE pull in, another AoE stun, and then an AoE fear to just stop multiple casts at once, right? An interrupt stops only one cast. That doesn't seem that good compared to stopping 5 or 6 of them, right? Now, Blizzard did not like this. So they implemented a change in Mythic Plus where most of the casts are now only interruptible by an actual interrupt. So this creates the situation where, let's just say, a caster is about to cast the Giga Beam of Death, and you knock up the caster. The Giga Beam of Death is interrupted, and as soon as the caster lands from his knockup, he starts immediately casting the Giga Beam of Death again. So now instead you knock him down with Earthquake. When the caster gets up, he immediately starts recasting the Giga Beam of Death. And then now you stun him. And then when he's out of the stun, he immediately goes back to recast the Giga Beam of Death. That's been the change in this season. The use of stops, which refers to any kind of crowd control which isn't an actual interrupt, the use of stops now is just to delay the cast. It no longer actually puts it on cooldown, so a caster will simply go back to try and try again to spam that ability until he's actually able to either cast it or be interrupted with an actual interrupt. Now this has been creating a couple of problems in Mythic Plus, right? Because some of the problems created by this system is that, first of all, groups are going to be inadvertently, unintentionally line up multiple casts at the same time, because if you pull, let's say, 8 mobs and 5 of those mobs are going to have a cast, let's just say as soon as you pull them you land all of your interrupts. So you have 5 players in your group, by miracle 5 players interrupt the 5 different casters, right? So now all of your interrupts are on cooldown. However, those casters have a couple of spells they can cast, or the cooldown of those spells is shorter than your interrupt cooldown. So eventually, those casters will try to cast again. And that's when you start your layer of the bouncing castle. A knockdown, a knock-up, a stun, another knock-up. Eventually, this will create a situation where all of those 5 casters will start to line up all of their spells to be cast at the same time, because you have kept delaying and delaying and delaying their cast by stuns and stops without interrupting them. So every single time they come out of a stun, or every single time they come out of a knock-up, you will have 5 different warnings on your weak auras or your boss mods warning you that there is 5 casts incoming. This can become particularly messy and also particularly deadly when you have those generic magic bolt being spammed by some of these mobs. And if you have, 4 or 5 of these mobs casting at the same time, very often a couple of those bolts will be targeting the same player. And that is also very often a recipe for death. Imagine, for example, you are in Arakara, where you have the big Scarab doing the big AoE and a bunch of the smaller ones casting web bolts, a bunch of 2 million damage hits. Well, what happens if you keep knocking them up and knocking them down and stunning them, and then eventually when they are free they cast all 4 of their web bolts at once while the big Scarab is doing the big AoE? What happens is that if 2 of those hit the same player, that player is going to die. This wouldn't really have happened if the cast times of those mobs were staggered, right? First you have one mob casting his web bolt, and then 3 or 4 seconds later there is 2 of them casting web bolt, and then 3 seconds later there is the last 2 mobs casting web bolt. But because you kept delaying their casts by knocking them up and knocking them down and stunning them and fearing them, you have lined up their casts all at the same time. And this creates the second problem. The second problem is that with all of these stops available, if we go, for example, and look at the more popular compositions in Mythic Plus right now, you have, for example, many comps with a Resto Shaman and an Augmentation Evoker, right? Augmentation as being an Evoker, a knock-up, a knockback, they have Upheaval for a second knock-up. Restoration Shaman has a stun, which then layers down a second stun. They also have Thunderstorm as a knock-up. A Frost DK is going to have Blinding Sheet to disorient the mobs. Protection Warrior is going to have Shockwave. And what this creates is that sometimes when you keep using these stops and unintentionally line up multiple casts to come off at once, what happens is the Augmentation Evoker will think, okay, now I am interrupting this dangerous cast. The Resto Shaman will be thinking, okay, now I will be interrupting this annoying heal. And as they interrupt, the Protection Warrior will use Shockwave. So now the Resto Shaman has just interrupted nothing, and the Augmentation Evoker has just interrupted nothing, because you have all of these layers of stops coming down from multiple players. And the problem with this is that this one would have been annoying, sure, in Dragonflight, but in Dragonflight, the Shockwave of the Protection Warrior would have interrupted the cast, would have sent those spells on cooldown. Meanwhile, in the War Within, this is no longer the case. If the Shaman wanted to interrupt the heal, and the Augmentation Evoker wanted to interrupt the damage ability, and they used their interrupt right after the Protection Warrior used Shockwave, what's gonna happen is that as soon as those mobs come out of the Shockwave stun, they will immediately cast again their abilities, because stops no longer put spells on cooldown, and now you find yourself without an interrupt on the Shaman and without an interrupt on the Evoker, with those 2 spells still being casted. That's the current bigger problem we have now in Mythic Plus when it comes to dealing with, in particular, because this will happen most of the times, during trash mobs, during trash packs, right? If we look at the current statistics about dungeons, the percentage is, this is low, okay? I am an archivist, so I have stored pretty much all of the stats of previous seasons for all of Dragonflight, so this is your week one of Dragonflight, Mythic Plus dungeon success rate, and this is how it looked in week 1. Yes, remember, some of you still have PTSD of the pre-nerf Ruby Life Pools or even Azure Vault, but look at this, pre-nerf Ruby Life Pools is still about as bad as current Stone Vault. which by the way has just gotten nerfed. And Green Battle is even significantly worse. Also, technically, right now we are in the second week of the season, not in the first week of the season. So we can open the dungeon difficulty for week 2, which is already significantly better because they got nerfed already significantly. So this would be week 2 of season 1 of Dragonflight compared to week 2 of the War Within, right? You can see a significant gap in difficulty. You practically have every single dungeon, barring Azure Vault by a little bit, above 50%. Currently, you only have 3 dungeons above 50% in success rate right now. If you're curious, we also have the dungeon success rate of week 2 of season 2 of Dragonflight with different dungeons. Even then, still every single dungeon above 50% except for barely Neltaros. So we can already tell within the first couple of weeks that the current success rate of the dungeon is significantly lower than the beginning of the seasons from Dragonflight. And we could say part of it, or definitely a good reason for it, has been this change to the crowd control. Because, you know, this time around, you can't complain. You know, you can't complain about affixes anymore. You can't complain about necrotic. You can't complain about sanguine. You can't complain about bolstering, about raging. All of these things are gone. So no matter how bad you think having to deal with the orbs spawning from the Xanath's Bargain or even from the 15 seconds death timers, they are still not nearly as bad as what we had in previous seasons of previous expansions. So what we have right now in Mythic Plus with this change system for interrupting enemies seems to be creating the biggest problem right now in Mythic Plus. Especially, of course, when it comes to pugs, because pugs are not coordinated, which means you're gonna have more and more often players trying to interrupt right as someone else is trying to use a crowd control, a stun, so their interrupt will go on cooldown without actually doing much because the mob was stunned instead. So as soon as he's out of the stun, he will start casting again, except now your interrupt is on cooldown. That seems to be the biggest issue right now in Mythic Plus. Obviously, some players have already come out and tried to offer some solutions. Now, the most sensible solution here would be to introduce the long-awaited and much appreciated grace period. The grace period meaning that if you use your interrupt within, you know, depending on balancing, within 1 second, within maybe half a second of the spell being cancelled. So if someone else nabs your interrupt and interrupts the spell himself, or if someone else is using a stun or a crowd control and stops the spell, if your interrupt was within 1 second or half a second of that happening, then your interrupt doesn't go on cooldown, or maybe gets a reduced cooldown, you know, like 3-second cooldown, for example, instead of 24. That would make it much less punishing and much more smooth to play in pugs. Because this one wouldn't be affecting coordinated groups that much, right? If we go to Mythic Plus, you know, people who do the world first +14 Arakara, these guys will very likely already have coordinated a rotation of interrupts. So it's very unlikely that a shaman will be interrupting when the augmentation evoker is about to knock all of the mobs up. However, once you go from a +14 down to a +9 or a +10 in a pug without communication, it's going to be much more likely. The shaman is not going to be tracking in his UI the cast time of the augmentation evoker's upheaval, so he knows when the knockup is about to happen and doesn't waste his interrupt. So it would be a practically harmless change for the top groups pushing for keys, and a much better change for pugs, for making it less frustrating to deal with this new system. The new system that crowd controls and stops no longer put the trash mob's spells on cooldowns, but only the interrupts do. That is what seems to be today's current problem when it comes to this first season of Mythic Plus, given that we are now noticing the completion rate, the success rate of the dungeons right now being quite low compared to previous seasons. So we hope that we get some more QOL changes, not just dungeon nerfs, because dungeon nerfs don't actually fix these issues, right? Sure, Blizzard nerfed Green Battle, they nerfed Siege of Boralus, but all of these issues are still remaining in the game. So that's what we hope to see in the near future, some more adjustments to this new crowd control and interrupt meta in Mythic Plus. But For today, on this Monday, this was all we had to point out about Mythic Plus. So we can now say our goodbyes and leave each other for the rest of this week. So we're starting our goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, but also for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, okay. As I open my window, I see some clouds. Although the sky is like only 40% cloudy, so we could do better.